Melynda, it's so wonderful to have you back with us. This is our second week of this course, and let us open in prayer. Loving God, we give you great thanks for the research and the wisdom and the enlightenment that Melynda is going to share with us in this class. Grant all of us the fire of your Holy Spirit to be your people in all that we do. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for being here. And I wanted to just tell you a little bit about what we did last week in case you weren't here. But last week we focused on Cliff Johnson and Robert McNeil, and we compared and contrasted their careers as ministers in the Southern Presbyterian Church and their different experiences in that institution. This week, we're going to talk more broadly about the Southern Presbyterian Church and its response to the Civil Rights Movement. And then we're going to tie that into the third trailblazing pastor, Reverend Dunbar Ogden Jr. And this is a picture of the back of Dunbar Ogden's head and his ear. This is a picture with the Little Rock Nine. It's one of the famous photographs from that era. So he was described as the well-dressed white man in a light suit. So we'll talk more about him a little later on in the presentation.
Are you going to describe what's going on in that photo?
Well, we're going to talk about it, but
Okay.
but that's basically it's a National Guardsman on the left, and the students who were part of the Little Rock Nine and Dunbar Ogden, who was there, who was the only white person who was with them, and sort of the spokesperson between the National Guard and the students. So it's an important picture, but we're going to talk about him a little later. So last week there was a question about where did Robert McNeil go to law school? So I just kind of wanted to close that loop, and that actually kind of opened up an area that was that ties into what we're going to talk about today. He went to the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa. He did not finish law school. He actually dropped out. And the quote that I told you last week, that this is the unvarnished version of what I told you.
It doesn't make a damn much more.
Exactly. And he also said, when I went back to look about in his autobiography about what he had to say about law school, he also said, there was no spirit of altruism or selfless devotion that I could detect. And that, quote, it is no wonder that our Southern gentlemen attorneys at law have nearly always stressed jurisdiction over justice on the question of slavery and discrimination. It's not what's right, but who has the power to say what's right that counts. And remember that, because we're going to come back to that point a little later. So last week we ended with this quote from Robert McNeil, and I thought it would be a good starting off point for today. This was his impression of his seminary training, that they were taught to preach on temperance, but not prohibition, politics, justice, but not politics, greed, but not economics, and prejudice, but not segregation. Generally speaking, the General Assembly of the Southern Presbyterian Church was more progressive about racial justice than individual presbyteries and certainly individual congregations. And the ministers were often caught in the middle. Ministers like McNeil and Cliff Johnson and Dunbar Ogden, who we will talk about later, they all trained at the Union Seminary in Richmond under the tutelage of a man named Ernest Trice Thompson, maybe somebody that you've heard of. But he was a very progressive Presbyterian minister, and my impression is, I wish Larry were here to verify this, that the ministers who were trained under him generally were more progressive than maybe the universe of Southern Presbyterian ministers at large.
Linda, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is my own ignorance, but are you saying Southern as in the South, or at that time was Southern Presbyterian Church a thing?
That's a great question. Thank you. So we touched upon this a little bit last week, but most of the mainline denominations split at the Civil War into Northern churches and Southern churches. And eventually they all came together. The Presbyterians were the last ones to come together in 1982. But at this time, you still had a Northern Presbyterian Church and the Southern Presbyterian Church, which at the time was called PCUS, Presbyterian
Because there's two
Church
segments of the Presbyterian Church now. Is one of those segments kind of the remnants of the Southern Presbyterian Church?
Exactly. There's actually more than two,
Okay.
but certainly PCA was the main breakoff group from people who were opposed to unification of the Northern and Southern Church.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so
And the Baptists are still split.
right.
The American Baptist and the Southern Baptist. is that-
Right.
You also have the Independent Baptists, who
Oh.
you know, so.
Yeah, so here's the surprising part about PCUS, the Southern Church. Just before the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, the General Assembly came out with a statement that you have up on the screen, affirming that segregation was out of harmony with Christian theology. And PCUS was the first major Protestant group in the in the South to call for an end to slavery, to segregation. There were overtures by different presbyteries during this time afterwards to rescind that statement, but there were never enough votes to do that. And yet, at the same time, all the other Protestant denominations were during this time moving toward reconciliation and reunification. And during this time, the Southern Church PCUS was the only major religious body that retained its approximate Civil War boundaries. So, I want to talk a little bit about pulpit dismissals because this was probably the main way in which congregations took action against ministers that didn't sort of fall into line with what the congregation believed. I think I said last week that the majority of Southern Presbyterian ministers either chose not to preach about race because they wanted to preserve their job security, or perhaps they even supported segregation. There was a smaller subset of ministers like Robert McNeil and like Dunbar Ogden who spoke out for integration and ultimately lost their jobs. And then there's an even smaller subset like Cliff Johnson who preached about, who spoke out in favor of integration and were able to maintain the support of their congregation. So I wanted to make sure that you all understand how truly unique, and I don't like using that word because I think it's overused, but I'm sure there are other examples of people like Cliff, but he was in a very small category. So during the years 1963 to 1965, just 2 years, 23 young ministers were forced out of Mississippi Presbyterian churches. And there's one example that I wanted to mention because I think he was a very common, typical example. His name was James Peck, and he was the pastor of a church in Enterprise, Alabama. He went there as his first job out of seminary. And in the 3 years there, he preached about integration on Race Relations Sunday, which was the second Sunday of February. And he used lots of biblical texts to support his position. And after that sermon, he was told by the elders of the church to never preach on that topic again. And he ultimately left the church on his own accord to go to a different church. So I think that that's probably a very typical example. And Joel Alvis, whose book was very helpful to me, he made this quote: the Presbyterian system was designed to protect the integrity of the minister's conscience, but in fact, when it came to matters of race, the system did not protect the minister's position. And ministers knew that they had to be cautious. There was a Presbyterian brochure that was widely disseminated called "How to Detect a Liberal in the Pulpit," and it was written by a group of laymen based in Selma, Alabama.
What a surprise.
So in 1964, the General Assembly of the Southern Church, PCUS, amended the Book of Order to explicitly state that race could not be grounds for excluding anyone from worship. And this was really prompted by a number of churches barring Blacks from attending worship. Many churches did not comply, and many churches fired pastors who wanted to comply. And the PCA Presbyterian Church of America denomination began to be formed out of a lot of these churches who objected to this change to the Book of Order. And McNeil in his autobiography talks about how he believed in his own church, First Pres Columbus, had a mission project where they funded basically the operation of a Black church in another part of Montgomery. And he believed that many Presbyterian churches made a point to fund these mission projects so that the Blacks would have their own separate church and wouldn't be interested in coming to their church. I thought that was an interesting observation. And there's a quote in my book from Cliff Johnson's son, Sam. According to Sam, Johnson had announced from the pulpit that if any Black person ever came to Westminster to worship, that person would be made completely welcome or he would immediately resign. So he staked his position. And there was an example from Joel Alvis's book that I wanted to mention. Congregations often, as I said, took action to defy the Book of Order. And one example that he gives is a Mississippi church that acknowledged that it was on dubious theological grounds by prefacing its exclusionary statement in this way. This is a quote. "Although we recognize that this is not what Jesus Christ would do, nevertheless, ... And then it goes on to say that Blacks could not attend worship and that church volunteers would be stationed in the parking lot to make sure that nobody came in. So it's pretty, pretty unbelievable. So churches were also either encouraged or actually took part in opening what were called seg academies. These were private schools that were formed as part of the massive resistance movement against school integration. And for the most part, Presbyterian clergy people were opposed to these seg academies because it was it ran counter to the 1954 pronouncement that we talked about earlier. The Potomac Presbytery, here close to home, strongly urged congregations not to lend their properties for the purpose of creating private academies, and sent a letter to the Virginia State Legislature that said, "We affirm our belief that the people of the state of Virginia should move toward compliance with the Supreme Court decision in a fashion consistent with good citizenship and sound Christian principles." So I'm not aware of any churches in the Potomac Presbytery that opened these seg academies, but there were a lot in the South that did. And I also wanted to touch on the role of Southern churches in supporting restrictive covenants. And most of you are probably aware of the language that was put into deeds to houses that restricted the owner from selling or renting or otherwise having the property occupied by a person who was not of the Caucasian race. That's how most of them were crafted. But there were some churches that were actually working on the other side of the, working along with the massive resistant movement. And one of the best examples is Cote Brilliant Church in St. Louis. They provided funds to the white family that was sued by a Black family who wanted to buy their house in St. Louis. And this is the famous Shelley versus Kramer case that went to the Supreme Court and basically decided that that these restrictive covenants were not constitutional. And so most of the examples that I have are from The Color of Law, which is a book by Richard Rothstein. It's an excellent book, highly recommended. But I think it's just it's really appalling that a church was helping to support this famous case. So I want to point out a couple people in this photo from the March on Washington. Of course, that's Martin Luther King in the bottom right-hand corner. And then the tall white man in the middle, who's got his arm around a young John Lewis, is Eugene Carson Blake, who was the stated clerk of the Northern Church, not the Southern Church. And he made a fairly well-known apology to Martin Luther King. He said, "We come and late we come." The Southern Church, PCUS, was the only mainline denomination that did not endorse the march. But the Potomac Presbytery had an interesting reaction to the march. They refused to endorse it also, along with the rest of the Southern Church, and they forbade ministers from attending the march and holding signs that said PCUS. So there was a small group of Potomac Presbyterian ministers, including Bill Single, who was at Old Presbyterian Meeting House at the time. Probably not Cliff Johnson. I don't know for sure, but this doesn't strike me as the kind of thing he would do. But they kind of pushed the boundaries on this prohibition by carrying signs that said Presbyterians US. So not quite, they just kind of, adhere to the letter of the law, not the spirit of it. So. But also something that came out of the Potomac Presbytery was a group called Fellowship of Concern. And this was organized by Randy Taylor of the Church of the Pilgrims in DC, who ultimately became co-moderator of the combined presbytery between the Northern Church and the Southern Church, which is called the National Capital Presbytery now. And this was in response to the March on Washington, and it was set up to support ministers who had lost their pulpits because of their views on integration. And it provided financial as well as spiritual and moral support and job assistance. There was a lot of sort of networking. Oh, okay, this person's out of a job. Well, this church is looking for somebody, that kind of thing. So I don't know for a fact that Cliff Johnson was a member. He didn't mention this in anything that I have, although I'm not sure I would have anything where he would have mentioned it. This was sort of it was a quiet movement. It was sort of underground. It wasn't very well publicized. They sort of kept it, purposely kept it very quiet on the down low, but eventually grew to 300 members. And they assisted 10 pastors in their first year, 1963. I kind of believe that Cliff Johnson was probably part of it because he would have known so many of the other ministers in the presbytery that were doing this. And Robert McNeil in his autobiography said, "No such help was available to me in 1959 because he lost his job before this. But I am now enjoying the thought of it looking back." And he did contribute money to them. So this gets back to the quote from Robert McNeil that we started with when we were talking about his law school experience and sort of the difference between jurisdiction and justice. And I think that this is a quote that summed up a lot of how many Southern Presbyterian churches approach the issue of slavery and segregation. The best defense was to skip the justice aspects and fall back on jurisdiction. It is much easier to say that something is none of the church's business than to say it is right or wrong. And that's something for you to take home and chew on. So now let's turn to Dunbar Ogden, the third of our trailblazing pastors. He was born in Mississippi in 1902. He was one of Robert McNeil's associate pastors at Breen Memorial when Robert McNeil was forced out of First Pres in Columbus. He went to Breen. Dunbar Ogden was forced out of Central Pres in Little Rock because of his involvement with Little Rock 9. And Robert McNeil called Dunbar Ogden to be his associate. And apparently Dunbar Ogden's son wrote that an old friend of the family, a minister in West Virginia, jumped at the chance to have him as his associate pastor. So McNeil doesn't mention Dunbar Ogden in his autobiography. I'm sorry, he does mention Dunbar Ogden in his autobiography, but he doesn't mention how they became acquainted to each other. So I don't exactly know how their paths crossed. But anyway, this is the well-dressed man in the light suit, well-dressed white man in a light suit. And he was the pastor, as I said, at Central Pres in Little Rock during the integration of Central High School in 1957. He accompanied the students to the school, walked with them, acted as a spokesperson with the commander of the National Guard. And as a result, he was forced to resign from his church. He never wrote about his experiences, but his son did, and that's the sort of my main source of information, and really the only book about Dunbar Ogden. He came from from two very prominent slaveholding families in Mississippi, and both of his grandfathers had fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side. And he had bachelor's and master's degree from Union Theological Seminary. So again, it's another tie to our other two trailblazing pastors. He suffered from terrible bouts of depression. In fact, one that was so bad that he spent a year at Johns Hopkins Hospital while his wife took their kids to be with her parents. And they had 4 sons. The Dunbar Ogden Jr., Dunbar Ogden III, the author of his biography, was the oldest. And then the second one was David. Their 2 younger sons were both born deaf, and they were at a boarding school for the hearing impaired during the Little Rock 9. Dunbar Ogden III was in college at Davidson. And so David was the only one who was at home during these events. And that's an important point to that we'll talk about a little later. So here's a picture of Central High School in 1957. A federal court had ordered integration to begin the following day, September 4th. But the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, called out the Arkansas National Guard to surround the school. And the school board instructed the 9 Black students who were planning to show up to stay away. There were only 9 because they were the only ones whose parents could be persuaded to let their children participate. The organizer of the families was a woman named Daisy Bates, who was a president of the Interracial Ministerial Association. And she called Reverend Ogden and asked if he would gather a group of white ministers together to accompany the students. He called about a dozen of his colleagues, and he said that they had one of 2 excuses. Either it will rip my church apart and destroy my effectiveness, or my wife won't let me. So he went by himself. And speaking of Daisy Bates, just a week or so ago, they unveiled a new statue in Statuary Hall for the state of Arkansas, and it was of Daisy Bates. So here she is. So then we're back to the picture that we started with. Sorry, what's that?
David has something to share.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I attended Little Rock Central in the 80s.
Oh my gosh.
And it was, we knew the history, but I didn't know as well. I didn't know the Ogden thing or Reverend Ogden thing.
Yeah.
Dunbar.
Yeah. The white man in the light suit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the picture that we started off with, and Reverend Ogden, confronted the National Guardsmen by saying, "Are you here to see to it that these children enter the school, or to prevent them from entering?" And it was clear that he was there to prevent them from entering. And his reply was, "The school is off limits to these people." And because they weren't going to protect the children from the angry mob, Ogden and some of the Black ministers who were with them had to work quickly to whisk the students away and get them out of danger. So one of the students that day was 15-year-old Elizabeth Eggford. She missed getting the information about the meeting point for the 9 students because Daisy Bates had contacted the students to tell them where to meet. But Elizabeth didn't get the information because her family didn't have a phone. But nevertheless, she had made a new dress for the first day of school that she's wearing, and she thought that the National Guard troops were there to protect her. Her family gathered around her that morning and they read Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Though a host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident. So after this confrontation, she was able to get to a bus stop and catch a bus home safely. And she described it as walking into a wolf's lair. And this is this picture was named by the Associated Press as one of the most important photos of the 20th century. And I have a feeling that someone's going to ask me, well, what happened to those women who were in the picture? Especially the one who's snarling. So her name was Hazel Bryan. Her parents pulled her out of Central High School because of the negative attention that she received, because this picture went all over the world. And it was in nearly every newspaper. But she had a change of heart, and when she had children of her own, she realized that they would grow up knowing that the woman in that picture with the horrible snarling face was their mother. And so in 1963, she apologized to Elizabeth Eckford, and they had a friendly but complicated relationship. But she ended up focusing a lot of her life's work on social work and helping single young Black mothers. So she has, somewhat of a story of redemption. Unlike the woman next to her in the dark dress who has her head turned. Her name was Sammy Dean Parker, and her father is the one in the hat behind her. She was really the ringleader of students who tortured Elizabeth and the other Little Rock Nine. When one of the nine was suspended for pouring soup on a student who had poured soup on her, Sammy distributed buttons that said 1 down, 8 to go. And she never apologized. In fact, she sort of hardened her views toward the whole situation as time went on. Elizabeth had a couple of difficult decades after these events. She really struggled. She attempted suicide numerous times. She had a son who was shot and killed by police, but she eventually got the medication that she needed for depression, and she became a parole officer. So the students attempted to integrate the school again on September 23rd, but an angry mob of 1,000 was there and the police could not control them. So again, the police were able to get the 9 students into patrol cars and to take them home. On September 24th, President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard, sent paratroopers from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and the students were driven in Army vehicles to school. In fact, they were driven in Army vehicles to school for the rest of the school year. The students were harassed and tortured, tripped, kicked, shoved downstairs, and body slammed into lockers. And the white administrators stood by and let it happen. And they were also not allowed to participate in any extracurricular activities. So the NAACP had asked Reverend Ogden to organize an interracial Thursday support group for the students and the families. And so he was in quite close touch with them throughout this year. And he had done all of this without getting any permission from his church or, talking about it at all. And among his fellow ministers, he was very isolated. The white ministers wouldn't criticize the National Guard out of fear that members would stop giving and stop coming. And the Black members feared for the economic well-being of their own members because people would be fired by their white bosses if they knew they were connected to it. So in fact, half of the parents of the Little Rock Nine lost their jobs. The Ogdens got hate calls and hate mail. Neighbors would cross the street rather than speak to them. Their phones were tapped by the FBI and Arkansas State Police, and Reverend Ogden feared that he would be called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a fear of a lot of civil rights leaders at that time. There were some people in the church who stood by him, but in the summer of 1958, there was a group of members who were calling every family in the church, asking them to abstain from their, making their contributions. And it was shortly after this that the church demanded his resignation. Interesting fact for us historians, the minutes of the session during this time have disappeared. So in May of 1958, Ogden accompanied Martin Luther King to the graduation of Ernest Green from Central High School. He was the first of the Little Rock Nine to graduate. But after losing in the Supreme Court, Governor Faubus in September of 1958 closed all 4 high schools in Little Rock rather than have them be integrated. And 44 teachers and administrators were fired at the same time for their involvement in trying to integrate the schools. The school did not reopen until a whole year later. But on October 26th, Reverend Ogden gave his farewell sermon. And then a couple of years after this, so he gave his farewell sermon, I think he had a year of unemployment, and then he went to West Virginia to be Robert McNeil's associate pastor. But during this time afterwards, while he was in West Virginia, his second son, David, who also suffered from severe depression, committed suicide. He had had a very difficult time with being a high school student in Little Rock during everything that was going on. After his parents went to West Virginia, he stayed back in Little Rock, but he had a hard time keeping employment because whenever people found out that he was connected with Dunbar Ogden, they would either harass him or physically abuse him. So in the biography by Dunbar Ogden's son, he's quoted as saying, "When I look back at my life, I have no regrets except for the death of David." And I think what's interesting is that there were no other ministers, black or white, in Little Rock during this time who had lost their church. And there were no other parents, black or white, who had lost a child, but Dunbar Ogden had lost both. So it was a very, very significant event for him. So I want to go back to Robert McNeil for a closing thought. This is from a book review of his book, Prophets Speak Now, which he wrote after he left Columbus. And so this is the reviewer's words, not Robert McNeil's words. And he says, the work, which is the book Prophets Speak Now, is no armchair philosopher's musings. Rather, it is the living thought of a man who knows firsthand how difficult it is to articulate the prophetic word of God within a church that has sipped too long the cocktails of complacency. So that's a thought to leave you with today. Are we sipping the cocktails of complacency today? But that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions or take any of your comments.
Can you tell us anything about the residuals in the church today?
From this time period?
Yeah.
Or,
Well, in this time period
yeah.
You mean residuals of segregation?
of racial animosity?
I mean, certainly we see that in all of society today, so I don't think the church would be immune from that. I think the McNeil quote about jurisdiction over justice, I think that is still the case today, where we say that's not an issue for the church. That's I think it's a cop out as McNeil thought it was, but yeah, I think that there are still some residual effects from that time period. Sure.
but you're not aware of them.
Well, you know, I can't point to an example,
Yeah,
but if I think about it, I might be able to come up
I
with something.
graduated from high school in '54.
Mm,
And of course, we had reunions of the high school from time to time. I didn't go for many years, but I did start going then. And I don't know, it might have been 20 years ago, I guess I raised in one of those reunions a question of getting together with the classes that graduated from Rosenwald. You know the Rosenwald system.
mm,
There were Rosenwald high schools all across the country.
oh, okay.
And there was one in Waynesboro. And so they had their own high school. And that fell flatter than a lead balloon.
Let's see, Kathy and Sandy, Kathy.
No, I was just gonna comment, you were talking about mission churches. So, the Mead Church where we serve bag lunch.
Yeah.
Was established as a mission church of Christ Church in 1865. And if you go in the church, the current pastor is the first pastor of color. And so you see all these pictures of, European, pastors and all the regalia and the entire, denomination or people of color. And this is the first one, he's from Africa.
Wow,
So it's very interesting, but
Yeah.
that is their heritage and it's on the cornerstone of the bell.
right.
And they continue to be a mission church. I mean, that's mostly their mission.
Yeah.
Their mission is mission,
Right.
is community service.
Where is that church?
It's on North Alfred Street, in Alexandria.
What's
Well,
it?
no, it's an Episcopal church. It's Mead Memorial Episcopal Church.
Mhm.
It's a very, very interesting, environment.
And there was a Black Presbyterian church in Old Town that was a mission church for the Potomac Presbytery. It wasn't for, that it was one of the things that Westminster contributed to during that time, but it wasn't Westminster's own mission church. Yeah.
We supported it.
Right, right,
A lot of these
right. And it did-
churches support each church.
It did not survive because they couldn't, they couldn't pay enough to get a pastor to do it, yeah.
So what happened to their building?
I don't know where the building was. So I don't know if it's been torn down or whether another church is using it. I don't know where it was located, so I'm not sure. But Sandy?
I was reflecting on the recent article in the Washington Post about the state of integration in schools now and how we've gone somewhat backwards recently in terms of segregated schools. And I think both blacks and whites in that poll, maybe whites more than blacks, were saying they favored integration, but they wanted their children to go to neighborhood schools. And so the suggestion I drew from the article to the situation was that more resources need to be put in the low-income schools, and more attention needs to be made to for housing, to have more low to moderate housing in more affluent neighborhoods, which brings us to what's happening in Alexandria right now. And are we sipping the cocktail of complacency?
This is an excellent book. It really lays out very clearly how the US government and local governments created the system of housing discrimination and housing segregation that we have today. It is excellent, highly recommended. And it really, so many things in our society today, the lack of, equality in the school, the lack of equality in the quality of schools is so related to this. And it is created, it's created a situation that's going to be hard to unwind because, you've got segregated neighborhoods that will just keep perpetually being segregated. Yeah, but it really is an eye-opening account of how the government took deliberate action to cause this to happen. It didn't happen because white people just wanted to live near white people and black people just wanted to live near black people. There were specific policy actions that were done to promote that, to cause that to happen.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, that has all of the sort of repercussions that we see today.
What did she say? What did you say?
Especially in housing,
Oh,
the
yeah,
redlining,
yeah,
and not
right,
very.
right. And it wasn't just banks. I mean, don't blame it all on the big banks. It was government policies.
Well, it's building roads, you know,
Right.
your neighborhood.
Exactly.
Right. And it wasn't just schools, it was for
Right.
good work, you
Right.
know, there's a hundred stores.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Arlington built a wall to separate the blacks from the whites. It still exists.
Where
But
is
it's,
that?
but it's a historical marker now of a sad time.
Uh-huh.
It's on the north side of the HC. Awesome.
Okay.
North side of what?
Of the hospital, right there on the basin.
Yeah, every,
So the
What
other
does it say?
Okay,
It's a wall
I'm,
that separated the blacks from the whites.
okay, so this is interesting. Because about the Presbyterian thing, and then I'm gonna make a question about the other people later. My understanding is that, as you know, Presbyterians in the English world, they were a faction of the Puritans within the Scottish and English churches, just like the Baptists and the Congregationalists were. Now, of course, there's more Presbyterians and Baptists right now than there are Congregationalists. But anyway, I want to point out that many people in the southern churches, Southern Presbyterians, Baptists, whatever, it wasn't, maybe race played a role in it, but it was also more than race. It was culture, and not only culture, also doctrine. Many southern people who generally were more doctrinally orthodox than the northerners were very concerned about theological compromise. Should they reunite with northern, New England type people? Because one of the reasons for the split among various Christian groups in the Civil War days was doctrine. The real reason was doctrine. It may have ostensibly been about slavery, but it was really about doctrine. And Southerners felt that if they reunited with the New England type churches, that they would be compromising doctrinal. And so this is a point. Generally speaking, compared to Presbyterians, the Baptists tend to be a lot more traditional theologically. And however, and this is because the majority of Baptists are in the South. Now, do you see hypothetically like a reunion of more Orthodox Southern Baptists and Independent Baptists with the more Unitarian American Baptists and Alliance Baptist? Do you see that happen hypothetically?
That's an interesting question. I don't have any knowledge of the history of the Baptist church other than, that they have split. And I went to a school in North Carolina that was initially connected with the Southern Baptist Convention, but then split from it. But I do know there's an interesting case here in Alexandria right now. Apparently, I just read this recently, First Baptist Church on Braddock Road, the big Baptist church, has gotten itself into a little hot water because they have had a female minister, and apparently that's contrary to the Southern Baptist Convention, which I wasn't aware of, and I guess somebody turned them in, for having a female minister, and they've sort of been put on notice that they need to get themselves into line with the Southern Baptist Convention, or they may be kicked out. And I think the church is sort of thinking about what it wants to do, but that may be a local case of a church deciding whether it's going to go its own way or stick with the Southern Baptist Convention. I just thought that was really interesting. I didn't know that actually Baptists did not allow women to be ministers. That was news to me.
Most of the Baptists that, of course, even in our presbytery, you made a point about pilgrims. I think we can all agree, even Larry has said it, that pilgrims cannot, and they might be Presbyterian, but they're certainly not in any sense a Christian church at all. And they're right up there in Kooky World with First Baptist downtown on DuPont Circle. Not First Baptist DC, which that's the church, by the way, that started the George Washington University. And First Baptist DC, if you've ever been there.
On 16th Street.
Yeah, they are unlike any Baptist church you would ever go to. They are certainly not your parents' or your friend's Baptist church. They're literally Unitarian Universalists pretending to.
Is that the church that Jimmy Carter?
Yeah, he was actually an assistant pastor there. Yeah, they're.
And so, David, do you have a question?
And so about, I want to point out that most of the Baptists that you know and interact with, that many of us know and interact with, are either Southern Baptists, or if they're not Southern Baptists, they're Independent Baptists. The Independent Baptists, because there was a time when the southern half of the Baptist world was starting to veer more towards a liberal, progressive trajectory. And this was right around the turn of the century. And so, but it continued gradually over time. And so those Southern Baptists who were involved in renewal movements began to feel that it wouldn't make sense for them to continue in the Southern Baptist world anymore. So they became what we might now call Independent Baptists, also known as Independent Fundamental Baptist, or just plain Fundamental Baptist, or IFB for short. My church back home in South Florida, First Baptist Church of Southwest Broward in Cooper City, is an IFB church that was actually started by First Baptist Hollywood, which is a Southern Baptist church. And the Independent Baptists, generally now, there really is no difference between the Southern Baptists and the Independent Baptists, except for the fact that the Independents, the IFB, they're still a little more traditional. than the Southern Baptists. Now, because of basically the late Clarence Sexton about the liberalism in the Southern Baptist world, he used to tell a story of how he began his ministry as a Southern Baptist. And he talks about how one time as a young preacher in the 60s, because he pastored his first church when he was only like 17. He was at this training session for pastors and their wives. And it was at another area church there in Tennessee. And one of the guest speakers they had that evening basically gave a lecture that was along the lines of, we're not really sure whether the Bible really says this and that, And Clarence Sexton, who as a young man was part of a renewal movement within the Southern Baptist Church, he and his wife Evelyn, they thought about that and they said, you know what, we cannot continue as Southern Baptists anymore. We're now going to we're going to join the Independent Baptists. And that's the movement he would be a part of until he died in December. And so eventually, in long story short, the Southern Baptists, who were on their way to becoming kind of like what much of the PCUSA is now, eventually they were able to go back to orthodoxy. And so that's why the Baptists right now, they have a more orthodox reputation. They have a better reputation theologically than many Presbyterians. And during that time, the Southern Baptists expelled their Unitarian wing, which the Unitarians, because there were some radical Unitarians, they were expelled in the 80s and they became known as the Alliance of Baptists. And the Alliance of Baptists is what First Baptist downtown is. If you're a Baptist church and you want to be in their group, they require, among other things, that you be pro-gay and pro-woman ordination. They don't allow for conscience exceptions like this denomination would, or even the other Baptist group that they split of their own will, the Cooperative Baptists. And so, however, the Alliance of Baptists is very small,
I think we have a question.
So the story continues.
Yes, it definitely
A
does.
couple questions.
Carol? Yeah.
Thank you, that was fascinating. But I wanted to share this fact that there's a person that many in this room have met and traveled with, and that's Millicent Fauntleroy, was Whitney's mother. And she was here in the March of Washington in 1963. She was a teenager in school, and they brought a school bus from Wilmington.
Wow.
For that day.
Wilmington,
North Carolina.
Delaware.
Carolina.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, North Carolina.
Thank you. Excuse me.
Because, and she was interviewed. It's on YouTube. I shared with some people a year ago when there was the anniversary.
Yeah.
And she talked about what it was like, and, there's pictures from then. And
That's cool.
Yeah.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's nice. Share, if you can share that.
David?
I'd like to bring it back to the three ministers that figure prominently in your talk. We know the end of Cliff Johnson's career. He died in active service here in the pulpit at Westminster. How did the careers of Robert McNeil and Dunbar Ogden close?
So Robert McNeil also died very young. He was 60 and he died of a heart attack. And he left, after he left Green Memorial, he left the ministry and he went and got graduate degrees at the University of North Carolina and ended up teaching at a community college in,
So he went back to school.
he went back to school to get additional degrees and taught history, I believe, yeah, at North Wilkesboro Community College or something like that. And then Dunbar Ogden lived into his 80s. In fact, he was in his 80s when his son wrote this book. I can't remember. So he was older than Cliff and Robert McNeil. He went to seminary maybe 15 years ahead of them. So he was in a sort of older cohort. So he was further along in his
He
career.
would not have
when he-
known that either of them.
No, he did know Robert McNeil because Robert McNeil.
Oh, but he would not have known either of them at school.
In school, right, correct, yeah. And I know that Dunbar Ogden ended up moving to California. He died in California, but I don't know if he ended up having another church after Green Memorial. Don't think he did, but I'm not sure about that. But he continued.
Did
work as a
McNeil
minister.
remain an ordained preacher?
Well, I think once you're ordained, you're ordained, right? Jacob, I mean,
Usually it takes an ecclesial act to terminate that, and if that did not happen,
yeah,
then yes.
I'm not aware that happened. I think he just decided he was
He
just
didn't
done.
want to be a
Sure,
preacher.
exactly. He decided to teach. There was a question back here. I saw him back here, but, well, that is probably a good place to stop and let you get to worship. Thank you so much again for coming.